All right. Well, hello, everybody. I hope we're live. I hope everybody's getting this. We are welcome to the Underneath live stream with Kale, Zelden. And to bring the band back together today, I have with me your friend Rod Dreher, my friend Rod Dreher. Rod, hello. How are you today?
I'm real sorry what Yoko did to us, man.
All right. Well, let's kick that off. I think I figured out the problem, but we are all set to go here with the Underneath. So welcome to the Underneath, everybody. I have with me today Rod Dreher, and today we're going to just jump right into our show, which is we're going to talk a little bit today about first off Tennessee. Rod, as we have not gotten together to talk in quite some time, and a lot of things have happened, but let's just catch the readers up, catch the viewers up to what's going on with Tennessee in this trans narrative business.
Well, about 9 days ago, I think it was, Kale, a transgendered person, a biological female who identified as male, burst into a Christian school, Presbyterian school in Nashville, killed 6 people, 3 of them children. Horrible thing. You know, sadly, this has become common in America. But what made this one so interesting is the police said when they shot her and killed her, she was in the middle of the crime. The police said that they captured a manifesto. That's the police's words. That would presumably say why she did the crime. Well, guess what? Here we are 9 days later. The police have not released the manifesto. Nobody knows what's in that thing, but I think a lot of people suspect, I certainly suspect, that it would lead people to draw negative conclusions about transgenderism because this is happening in a context of trans days of vengeance, things like that. Go ahead.
Well, right with that. So if we look at the timeline, right, the timeline, they had this Trans Day of Vengeance slotted and ready to go, right? If memory serves, right, this had been slotted and ready. In fact, I knew a number of people got banned on Twitter because they had sort of made some comments about the Trans Day of Vengeance. Apparently, that post had gotten flagged by the algorithm.
Yeah, I was one of them.
You were one. Okay. Yeah. So but just prior to that, about 4 or 5 days prior to that, this woman went into a Christian school, right, and did their business. So I think it's just interesting in terms of setting up the narrative, because this horrific event happened in the sort of in anticipation almost of what was going to happen the following weekend, nationwide.
Yeah, well, we don't know if there's a direct connection there. I think the manifesto might shed some light on that, but we don't know what the manifesto is because they haven't released it yet.
Right.
I think they have to release this because not only because of the context you just brought up, and Trans Day of Vengeance was set to happen the day after Trans Day of Visibility, as if there are no more visible people in this country than trans people, right?
Certainly in terms of the media. I mean, it's if you look at the numbers of people, like in live in the flesh, so to speak, versus the kind of copy and dominance on the airwaves. I mean, it's really kind of a striking thing, isn't it?
But here's the most ghastly thing about this event in Nashville. And a lot of people have noticed this. The media went into full preserve the narrative mode, turning this massacre of Christians, including Christian children by a transgendered person, into a story in which the real victims were LGBT people. I don't think that anybody thinks that all trans people are potential mass murderers. I certainly don't think so. If anybody thinks so, they're crazy and malicious. But come on,
it's such a weird inversion, isn't it? I mean, it's just I mean, again, and this is not new to me. I'm certainly not new to you, but flip the victim perpetrator narrative. I mean, and the whole thing is absurd, right? Imagine if a conservative Christian, just a Christian, let's just say a Christian, walked into, I don't know, like a drag queen story hour and started shooting things up. I mean, seriously, like imagine that.
Well, we don't even have to imagine that, because when these things have happened, like at the Pulse nightclub, things like that, suddenly it's wall-to-wall homophobia. And you know what? Sometimes that is justified. We have to think about, are these things, are there factors in the culture that are causing disturbed people to react this way? Didn't happen here, has not happened here. It's not going to happen here because the capital R, capital C ruling class, as I like to say, wants to control the narrative. And I got to tell you, Kale, I don't know how it's been in your circles, but since this happened 9 days ago, so many people I know said this was a Rubicon for them, seeing how blatantly the media and Joe Biden, the president, moved to shift the narrative to prevent people's eyes from going towards the possibility, just the possibility that this could be ideological anti-Christian terrorism by a trans person, or that this trans person might have been taking testosterone and that could have ramped her up, her aggression up, which we know happens.
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, you and I were texting back and forth that morning, that it happened. And the first thing I thought of, Rob, was our great conversation. One of my favorite conversations we did under our old show, The General Eclectic, with Helena. And, when she both describes in her Substack piece, but also in our show, what it was like to be a young woman on testosterone. My immediate thought to you was like, man, like this stuff drives you crazy. And especially if you're not accustomed to it,
yeah. As you pointed out to me at the time, as males, we have a long time to get accustomed to this stuff, and still we don't do it. That's why men are generally so violent. But at least this is part of our normal. Imagine some poor teenage girl who's told that getting on testosterone is going to solve all your problems, and then she finds herself full of rage. We don't know that's what happened here, but the fact is we're not allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, so the silence, right? The great wall of silence, both enforced with our social media algorithms, but also, polite people don't talk about these things, right, Rod? I mean, so what are we to make of that wall of silence? I mean, how do you break that wall of silence?
I think we have to talk about it. If the media won't talk about it, ordinary people have to talk about it. Pastors have to talk about it. I was just this week talking to some friends of mine in my hometown, St. Francisville, the Methodist Church, which is my family's home church. The local Methodist congregation has voted to stick with the liberal pro-LGBT national denomination. And it's caused, I understand, a lot of anger and dissent. The reason I bring that up here is because some of my friends I was talking to, they aren't particularly pro-LGBT, but they just wanted to be nice. And it's like, and one of my friends was even angry that the pastor scheduled a vote, polled the people. I said, what's wrong with asking the people what they think about this issue? My friend said, well, because it caused division. It should have just been done without talking about it.
So it's a kind of an argument from a standpoint of harmony, that harmony is the sort of the greater good, right?
Right.
Rather than truth or something. I don't know.
Exactly. And this is a very Southern thing, as you know, that we value social harmony above anything else.
Especially within the tribe, right? Especially within the tribe.
Right. And so the reason I bring this up in connection here with what happened in Nashville is because, as you say, respectable people, middle-class people who want to be nice and non-bigoted don't want to talk about this stuff. But you have to talk about it, because look what's happening. I mean, we have this disinformation machine that is gaslighting everybody 24/7. And it just happens, I think, to have gone into overdrive on the Nashville story and showed itself, instead of just humming along quietly in the background. They forgot to shift gears smoothly, and it allowed people to see the kind of gaslighting that I think is going on all the time about a number of things.
Yeah, I was genuinely impressed, I guess, in not in a good way, but I was impressed, Rod, that they were able, again, the sort of the curators and the crafters of the narrative, as you and I like to talk about, but they were able to successfully, really within about 24 hours to 48 hours, to move this, right to their favorite position, which is that this is ultimately about guns, right? That this is about, gun control, and how dare those legislators do nothing about it. And, it was sad, frankly, to see. And then not only was it about guns, but then it became about, storming these various state houses. And let's remember, Rod, actual storming of state houses looked a lot like a certain thing that happened on a certain day in January about the 6th.
Disappeared.
It's gone. It's gone.
It's gone.
So then it became about guns, and that politicians are not protecting kids from guns, and it just a totally successful shift. And now, Rod, I read the news. I'm all over the internet too much, frankly, and the story's gone. The story is, in fact, gone. It is.
Might as well never happen, except for the gun part. Like I was looking at the New York Times this morning, they had a story by some country musician, Episcopalian in Nashville, saying that country music can heal the wounds of the shooting, and it's all about guns. The Country Music Awards, they had a finale of the national broadcast that brought 5 drag queens onto the stage, and this is Country Music Awards. Yeah. So what does this tell you? I guarantee you that most of the country music audience ain't down with that, but it doesn't matter. The elites are the ones who set the agenda. And this is not news to you and me. It's something that we've been talking about for a while, but it's just becoming more and more difficult to deny.
Right. And the implications of this sort of thing, like, whatever one thinks of this curated narrative that we are being fed, right, and it's very closely sort of trimmed on the edges, and it's all like very sort of neat and proper. There is, in fact, reality, right? There's something going on here, and I got to tell you, Rod, I teach at a Christian school, a Catholic school, and those sort of days after this event, this horrific massacre of, I think it was 3 adults and 3 kids. I mean, they were young kids, 9-year-old kids, younger than even my youngest child. And, it feels kind of weird. Like, I don't know, this one hit me in a slightly different way because of the motivation. Now, no, I go to I teach and operate at a fairly mainstream school, and we're Catholic, and we don't hide the fact that we're Catholic, but, certainly, if you look at, sort of the on the books reality of sort of Catholic teaching, for instance, on sexuality, et cetera, we are clearly at odds with this sort of emergent and now seemingly prevailing narrative or worldview. And it feels a little bit weird. Like, why wouldn't I be? And it's not like I've exactly shut my mouth about this stuff.
No. And did you see, just before this happened, you saw different people all around the internet, including the lieutenant governor of the state of Minnesota, wearing T-shirts that said "Protect Trans Kids" and had a knife there. Some pro-trans memes and T-shirts, things like that, have machine guns there. So this is not what happened in Nashville. Almost certainly didn't come out of nowhere. But we're supposed to turn our eyes away from it. Kale, I remember back in the 2000s, 2004, 2005, when I moved to Dallas, I was working at the Dallas Morning News on the editorial page. Yeah. I'd come out of New York, had been there for 9/11, and was really interested in Islamic terrorism. Well, I found out, to make a long story short, that the Dallas Central Mosque, the biggest mosque in Texas, was funded by the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were holding extremist meetings there. They were doing it openly. They weren't trying to hide it. Right. I could not get our newsroom to care about it. Thankfully, I worked on the editorial page. My boss there said, "You're welcome to write about it. Just make sure you've documented everything," which I did. Right. But it was incredible to me, because the people running the newsroom at that time, I think they're all gone now, they were more afraid that some Bubba somewhere in Texas would have a negative thought about Muslims than they were about the fact that the local mosque was holding radical meetings and teaching from the books of Sayyid Qutb, the Muslim.
Qutb, yeah.
I mean, but this was like almost 20 years ago. But this is how the narrative control works. And that's when I first knew that even in matters of extreme national interest, like Islamic terrorism, you cannot trust the media. They will curate the story.
So I have a question for you about that, because it's something I've been thinking of, and this might help us transition a little bit into the next bit, if you don't mind. But what is the role? So what does that tell us about worldviews, right? You talk about this 20 years ago in Dallas, and that you talked about there was a national security / national interest angle to covering the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood was supporting the biggest mosque in Dallas, right? And so you are looking at, if I'm making sense, stop me if I'm not, but you were looking at this as a sort of a local security issue, and the way in which the inimical forces had sort of wended their ways into, the lives of ordinary Americans, or sort of something like that.
Sure.
What? Sorry, I'm being inarticulate here, but why did the people who were running the newspaper not see it as a national security or a national interest story?
I think because it didn't fit their narrative. I remember.
So then the narrative is not the same thing as national interest.
Right, absolutely. And
okay.
Like the narrative is more important to maintain than even just reporting the facts, throwing them out there and seeing where they lead us. I remember, in fact, once having because I was attacked viciously by the local Muslim Brotherhood leadership, and they once called me and my boss and the editor-in-chief of the newspaper, a really good guy, called us to lunch to talk this out. And my boss really believed, that the editor-in-chief really believed, that if we just got together, had a frank and full exchange of views, we could all be one big happy family. And I said, we're not going to do this. They believe radical things that are incompatible with liberal democracy and living in peace with us. Right. And he just couldn't accept it. So we sat down for lunch. And at the end, I got the head of the local Muslim Brotherhood to admit that, they believed in stoning homosexuals, killing homosexuals, and stoning women taken in adultery. And I remember on the long car ride back to the office, the editor-in-chief was like, wow, I didn't see that coming. Like, I told you. But here's the thing. He's not a bad guy. He just was so bought in to the narrative that he couldn't allow himself to see reality. And I think that's probably, to be as generous and as charitable as I can, I think that's probably the case with a lot of these reporters and editors and producers in newsrooms thinking about Nashville. They are so programmed from their college years, from the circles they hang out in, which are totally not diverse at all in terms of ideology. They're so programmed by that they don't know any other way to think. That's the first response.
Yeah, that's right. I can't, and maybe there's a certain amount of irony of sort of two conservative Christians, talking about this on a live stream, but I can't help but think that what we're running into is what any of us would call dogma. Like these are sort of these unquestioned presuppositions that are foundational to a worldview. Yet in their worldview, they don't subscribe to the notion that they hold on to a dogma. It's an interesting, curious thing.
They think that reality has a liberal bias, right?
That's right. I forgot about that.
Well, yesterday there was an election, a mayor's election in Chicago, and the progressive candidate won. Now, this guy, Brandon Johnson, the progressive candidate, a black guy, he gave a speech a few days ago in which he said this whole election is about black power versus white wealth, or black labor versus white wealth, something like that. He cast it in explicitly racial terms. His opponent, by the way, was white, a Greek American guy.
Right.
And Brandon Johnson won. Now, and he's also super left-wing, defund the police type, although he tried to turn that around. The reason I bring it up is this. We are going to see probably people starting to leave Chicago because people were feeling really down about Lori Lightfoot, the failed mayor, outgoing mayor.
Right.
If people start to leave Chicago because they're afraid the violence is going to get even worse, what do you think the media is going to say about it? White flight, even if it's middle-class black people leaving.
Right, of course.
So
in other words, they're leaving because they just don't like black people, not because maybe they don't like crime or something like that.
Right. Or economics. Last week, I met a guy here in Budapest, a white South African guy who's here doing PhD work or something. And he told me he was at a party with Chris Rufo, and Chris and I were talking about this afterwards. The guy was saying how bad things are in South Africa. And, I'm like, really? You never hear much about South Africa, because when you and I, Kale, were in college in the 80s.
It was all about apartheid. Yeah.
Got to stop apartheid. Apartheid falls. Mandela comes to power.
Yep.
Everything's great. I said, maybe there's some problems there. I think I hear every now and then, but I had no idea how bad it was. He said that the power grid is collapsing. He said, my parents in Johannesburg have only 4 hours of power a day. The water grid is collapsing. I went back after that conversation and looked all this up, and he's completely right. So why are we not hearing about this? Well, we're not hearing about it, I believe, because it doesn't fit the narrative. What happened in South Africa is after apartheid fell, they had hard, what we would call DEI laws, where they had to hire managers in all firms, private and public, that look, had to get it like Ibram Kendi would say, if 70% of the people in South Africa are black, 70% of the managers have to be.
Right.
Well, they ended up that there weren't enough like nuclear engineers or competent managers to run these facilities. So they got filled with patronage, black patronage hires by the ANC. Surprise, the country's falling apart, and now not even black people have clean water or power. The point is only this, is that reality, as you say, comes back. Narrative can only take you so far. But the South African guy said, and he and I'm going to do an interview with him for my Substack.
Oh, good.
He said the point that Western people need to understand is when you began to build a society based on anything but reality, and that includes competence at doing technical jobs, this is what's going to happen. Your country's going to fall apart.
Right. It's interesting to me because in my orbits, in educational orbits, there's all kinds of, one of the ways in which DEI is sort of finds its way into sort of the inner workings, into the marrow of a school, is to talk about it in terms of, they use this phrase, cultural competency, right? And what they mean by cultural competency is not what you might think, which is like to be competent is to be able to perform like a function. Right. No, of course, we're not saying to return to apartheid, sir. Anyway, I just read a comment. But like, in other words, to be able to do something, right? So like, for instance, Rod, I have a competency to mow my grass, right? To trim the hedges, right? To rake the leaves. Like I have a certain competency in to do that. Now that's not a high level competency, of course, right? But we understand competencies like, can you do the task? Can you do the thing? Well, they use cultural competency as a kind of way of, do you have right think? Right. So that cultural competency, not like competency,
right.
but cultural competency is to have the right opinion, is to understand, that there's systematic this and there's structural that, all of those sorts of things. And that there are these sort of false hierarchies of whiteness, right, that need to be replaced with the proper, reordering. We need to center, black trans lives, all that kind of stuff, right? So that is sort of what cultural competency for those people become, right? Or that's what it is. But what is forgotten, and I kind of think what you're getting at with the story about South Africa, is that South Africa is losing their actual sort of political competencies or society competencies in order to make like in order to make the water show up, in order to make electricity show up on time, right? These are the kind of things that are non-negotiables. Like we can't have them. There's that great book, I think I banged on about this about a year ago, but I was reading it about the Great Awakening. He's a fellow that teaches in Georgetown. He does the de Tocqueville stuff. Joshua Mitchell. Yeah. And so he tells this great story, and I really recommend that book. It's a fantastic book. But there's a great story in it in which he says he uses the image of bottled water as an instance in which we have forsaken genuine societal competency, which is to deliver safe, fresh water vis-a-vis the tap, right? And we have done a workaround of that cultural incompetency by defaulting to bottled water instead of tap water. And it's a great sort of, so like that is actual competency. What we're seeing, I think, in South Africa, according to the guy you meet here, is that we're losing that just basic level of, can we like live together and provide services, like just basic levels.
And the guy, to be clear, this guy was not defending apartheid by any means, but he was simply saying this is the tragedy, of doing a good thing, which was ending apartheid, has resulted in the collapse of the infrastructure of the most advanced country in Africa, and it's hurting Black people too. And I only bring that up because it happened this week, but it's a clear case of narrative of reality defeating narrative.
Right,
And
right, right,
so,
right.
and we're not hearing about it in the West. The reporting is just not there. Why do you think that is?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it seems that we have a motivated group of people, so who are in charge, because they want a different narrative, right? They want a different reality, maybe.
Well, I think you're referring, I think, to that fantastic piece by Jacob Siegel in Tablet,
right.
the magazine, online magazine Tablet, called "The 13 Ways of Looking at Disinformation." Folks, if you haven't read this, go to Tablet and read it. Jacob Siegel, Siegel, is the author. It's an incredible piece of work. And in it, he basically says that we now live in a situation in the United States. It started with the war on terror, but it's been carried on by every administration since then, in which the ruling class of this country believes that it has a right to rule no matter what its failures are, and that it can and will and does you collaborate between the military, the intelligence agencies, the tech world, big business, and so on, to manufacture and control a certain narrative. And this narrative is, they do it with the threat of, we have to protect everyone from domestic terrorism. Well, guess what? We're all going to become domestic terrorists if we dispute the narrative. That's right. And the piece is really long and detailed about how this has worked, from Russiagate to COVID and on and on.
Well, there was a curious moment. So I stumbled upon the article fairly early on, and I started reading it, and it's one of those things I kept scrolling, on my phone. I'm like, how long is this thing?
Very long.
This is super long, right? And at any rate, I eventually I went and I printed it out, and I just sort of copied and pasted it onto a Word document. It's like 22 pages long. So it's a very lengthy document. But what was revealing a number of things were revealing to me, and I immediately tweeted out. I said something to the effect of, when historians, in a generation, write the history of what we've just lived through in the past decade and a half, this is one of those must footnote pieces, because it is chock full of just real detail, connecting the dots. It's a thorough piece of not only reporting but framing. I think it's a really, and I kind of hate when people use the language of like, it's important, but it's important, actually. And to me, the moment, the thing that was shocking to me, and just as sort of a quick backup, I know a number of people, a couple of people really closely, who were part of Trump's transition team, right? So when a president wins an election, there's this whole process in which the existing regime is sort of trending down, and the new regime is sort of trending up, right? And it's sort of building out its team and all of that, right? So there's this transition, and it's a big deal. And so I know a couple of people who were involved with that. And I remember, later on talking with them, and this is after, what some silly thing that Trump had done this or that and the other, right? And just sort of like, I remember just asking, like, why are you sticking up for this guy? I mean, why are you sticking up for the Orange Man, right? And I know we're going to get to Orange Man in just a second. And he just looked at me in the face. He says, Kale, you have no idea what this administration faced from before they even, raised his right hand and swore him in. He says, I have been in D.C. for over 20 years. I have never seen anything like this. Now, at the time, I must admit, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit, that I was sort of like, all right, dude, you're kind of cooking up reasons why, to stick up for the Orange Man, like in sort of this, that kind of annoying way that I used to sort of go there. But what you learn in this piece here, and it's on the first page, and I'm just going to read this section real quick, Rod. And he says, in his last days of office, this is from the Siegel piece, a guide to understanding the hoax of the century, right? And he says, in his last days in office, President Barack Obama made the decision to set the country on a new course on December 23rd, 2016, right? So remember, Trump will be sworn in a month from then, right? Something like that. Obama signed into law the Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, right, which used the language of defending the homeland to launch an open-ended offensive information war. And and we know this, right? This is actually true. This is not some sort of, breathy, obscure blog or a Twitter, tweet post or anything like that. Like, we know that this in fact happened. And what this did is it mechanized for political reasons, very clearly political reasons. It weaponized the vast infrastructure of the surveillance state against the country itself. Right. And I think that this really explains why, and then Siegel then goes through like all the Russiagate stuff and all of these things. But what it really helped me understand is that that all of the stuff that we heard about, Trump was in fact, not all of it, but a lot of it was built out and used and weaponized by an unelected class of people who were simply outraged that the people would choose somebody not in their class.
Right, exactly right. And we found out after Trump was defeated for re-election, I think, was it in Time magazine that someone wrote about the secret cabal that saved America?
Yeah, like this is like an actual story. This is an actual story.
So this is what the paragraph that really got to me about the Siegel piece. And I should say that I have no idea if Jacob Siegel is on the left or on the right. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
And I love the fact that you can't tell.
Yeah.
He writes, what do the members of the ruling class believe? They believe, I argue, in informational and management solutions to existential problems, and in their own providential destiny and that of people like them to rule regardless of their failures. As a class, their highest principle is that they alone can wield power. If any other group were to rule, all progress and hope would be lost, and the dark forces of fascism and barbarism would at once sweep back over the earth. Now, Kale,
hold on. Read the next line. Read the next line. I think this is important. I think this is important.
All right. While technically an opposition party is still permitted to exist in the United States, the last time it attempted to govern nationally, it was subjected to a years-long coup. In effect, any challenge to the authority of the ruling party, which represents the interests of the ruling class, is depicted as an existential threat to civilization.
Right. In other words, Rod, our democracy.
Our democracy.
One of the things that I've been tweeting about for years, and who cares? I've got like 2,000 followers, like whatever. But I've been just like, every time I see that phrase, our democracy, capital O, capital D, they really mean that actually. Like ours as in not mine or yours, right? It's theirs. It's their democracy, right? And that's we should start saying, like, their democracy, because they have this sort of almost messianic sense that it is theirs to do with, and how dare the opposition party. It reminds me, sorry, and I'll let you talk here in a second. It reminds me of that poor team that always has to play the Harlem Globetrotters, right? I mean, Republicans are that team. What is it? The Generals, I think it's called. Yeah. It's like the loser team. Like, they literally get paid to get to lose elections.
Yeah, well, the whole trans narrative is a microcosm of this, because you notice how any criticism at all of whether or not you should give cross-sex hormones to little children, etc., immediately talk about existential threat. Trans children will die. You'll have blood of suicide on your hands.
Rod, the real genocide, right? The real genocide is the narrative against these victim souls.
Yep, exactly. And so you see, though, in a microcosmic way, the broader narrative that is gaslighting the whole country. And I got to tell you, I live here in Budapest. I'm looking out as we speak to the Danube River, but people over here in this country, they can see so clearly what the United States is doing. Last week, the U.S. Agency for International Development put out a press release saying that the U.S. government, for the first time, is committing a lot of money to fighting for, quote, rule of law overseas to address all the, quote, unmet justice needs of 5 billion people around the world. Now, it's written in bureaucratic, therapeutic language that is Orwellian.
Right.
What they're saying is that we in Washington and the ruling class know better what the whole world needs in the whole world. Mm-hmm. People in Hungary know well that whenever the Brussels bureaucrats start talking about rule of law concerns, it's a euphemism, meaning that they don't like the democratic decisions made by the voters of Hungary, and they're going to take back our democracy. Well, Washington is doing that too. And Kale, the thing I just read about how the ruling class in the United States believes it has a right to rule no matter how badly it's screwed up. The ruling class screwed up Iraq, screwed up Afghanistan, and nobody's answered for that. Last week, or maybe 10 days ago, Representative Matt Gaetz, had the defense secretary and the chief of the Joint Chiefs head testifying. Not a single person has had to pay a price for the failed withdrawal from Afghanistan. They don't care. Nobody gets punished for this stuff. Now we're in the middle of pushing towards war with Russia, because this time it's going to work.
Right.
Democratizing and liberalizing Ukraine is going to work. I guess that I don't want to get too broad here, but it just drives me nuts because Jacob Siegel is right. This is what the narrative is constantly doing. These people who run this country, whether it is in politics, in business, and they're all the same. They're all pushing the same story. And by the way, Siegel says in this piece, he says that what's happening is a sort of the emergence of the word he uses, totalitarianism, that doesn't look totalitarian. I'm like, dude, read Live Not by Lie.
I know. One more time, like you get there early, and your gut instinct is sort of spot on here. That's exactly where we're going. It's a kind of narrative jail, actually, that we're all kind of living in. And, and I gotta say, as and he mentions COVID, and he mentions the elections, and he mentions a bunch of different things. And, I'm constantly in this state where I'm like, okay, I'm looking around and nothing, it doesn't pass the sniff test. Like, am I the crazy one? Am I the crazy one? And, you read a piece like Siegel's piece on disinformation, you're like, well, actually, no. See, like I actually, one still does have certain instincts. If you have a a nose for it, or an eye for it, or an ear for it, it's really, these manipulations are huge. And of course, we haven't even talked about the Twitter files. What Taibbi and Schellenberger and Barry Weiss, what was revealed in that. I mean, that's detailed, of course, in the Siegel argument, or at least hinted at. It's a pretty tremendous thing. But I think what I keep coming back to is that we are combating here, or we're seeing a creedal reality. Like, this is something about belief.
It's a war of religion.
Right. That's exactly right. It really is a war of religion, and we really need to see it this way, because the people who run the show understand themselves as a kind of clerical caste, and therefore there is clerical privilege. Rod, I'm a Roman Catholic. I'm very familiar with these kind of patterns of clerical privilege, and the irony of the last 6, 7, 8 years from my own life is the very people who in the church complain about clericalism are the very ones who abuse clericalism the most. Yeah. Right? It's a strange sort of projection of onto everyone else of the very thing that you yourself are engaged in.
Just today, before we came on, I saw a press conference from Canada where some non-binary Canadian parliamentarian was announcing legislation that would criminalize criticizing drag queens within like 200 feet of a drag queen story hour. You could pay a $25,000 fine if this gets passed into law simply for criticizing the sacred. I mean, this is freaking blasphemy laws, and yet they don't see it.
Right. Wait, blasphemy laws are bad. That's what can we call this? We're protecting the weak and the vulnerable, right? I mean, it's the theft. I mean, it's the downright theft of a Christian frame with which to see victims, right? It's this weird eternal return to sort of sacred victimhood. It's really, really strange.
Yeah, when you talk about eternal return, that's a phrase associated with Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yep.
And I'm afraid what's going to happen, gosh, this is too big to get into now, but I'm afraid what's going to happen is with so many Christian churches capitulating to this fraudulent version of Christianity, that you're going to see people who are seeking reality, especially young people, throwing aside the Christian faith and moving towards some form of Nietzscheanism, which is scary as hell. But I think that the unwillingness of so many churches, even when pastors and lay people know better, the unwillingness of them to stand up for truth, stand up for themselves, stand up for their own people, is it's so repulsive.
Yeah, no, it's and it's coming and naturally, and I know this is something that we have talked about, but that the that with the advent or sorry the sunsetting of a kind of loosely but broadly distributed Christendom, right, or Christian sensibilities, that we are left with kind of material and ultimately, in my opinion, nihilistic options, and those nihilistic options seem to be breaking into two basic ways, right? Left and right works for the purposes of this conversation. But what we're seeing, with the sort of the emergence of, the trans demon mascots at state houses, like we have one option, which is sort of this, what does Mary Harrington call it? Fully automated luxury Gnosticism on the one side. And then you've got this sort of this strange emergence of a kind of post-Christian, pre-Christian, Nietzschean will to power, like on the right. And, honestly, if those are our options, like, we have it's bad. There's a certain doom there, right?
Yeah. And, we saw this week something that no American has ever seen. A former president of the United States arraigned on felony charges, Orange Man, as always. And, to look at this from abroad, and I've talked about several other people, Americans over here about this, and we feel like we're watching our own country tear itself apart.
That's right.
Now,
that's right.
I think our people who know me know that I have no particular love for Donald Trump. I'm for Ron DeSantis. Nevertheless,
Rod, I'd argue that your disgust for the Orange Man has gotten you into all kinds of trouble.
Yeah, it has.
Honestly,
Trump people. Nevertheless, this is so clearly politically motivated. I mean, even Jonathan Chait in New York Magazine, an arch liberal, said this shouldn't have happened. That the charges are so flimsy. This was clearly just political.
Yeah.
And what I think is going to happen is this is going. I mean, it may end up ruining the chances of my guy, Ron DeSantis, because conservative voters will be so outraged at this nakedly political attack on Trump and perversion of the justice system by this woke DA that I think people will stop trusting any institution. And it's
why is that, Rod?
Yeah, because how can you trust it when you've had this comes out of Russiagate, the 4 years that Jacob Siegel talks about, where the media and the Democrats tried to discredit the president on flimsy charges. Now it looks like it's happening again. Not that Trump is a Boy Scout, but John Edwards, a former Democratic senator, vice presidential candidate with John Kerry, he was acquitted of similar things because they're really hard to make stick. And it just looks like that they're going after Trump by any means necessary. And which is also coming at the end of what we found out about COVID, the Twitter files, and all of that. It's such a fragile moment for our democracy. And yet the ruling class is going hell for leather to take down anybody who challenges them. And I just can't see a good ending here.
Well, no, I was thinking about it just from an electoral standpoint, because I do think that Mr. Bragg from New York City, what is he, the Attorney General?
Alvin Bragg, the DA.
Alvin Bragg, the DA. Sorry, the DA. Alvin Bragg, the DA of Manhattan. Clearly he's a member of the party, right? And he's acting at the behest of the party. Now, when I say it that way, even in my head, just as I said out loud, it reminds me of the way in which people would talk about the party in a Soviet idiom, right? But I do think that that's how we have to sort of see this. This is again, I hate that I even have to do this kind of throat clearing, right? It's like, independent of whatever it is Trump has done, either personally or legally, the fact remains, and this is not something coming from the right wing ecosphere, but this is clearly politically motivated.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
why is it politically? It seems to me that either they're so scared of Trump that they want to get rid of him, but with the flimsiness of these charges, it almost seems to me, right? I don't know what you think about this. It almost seems to me that they want Trump to be the nominee because they feel like they can beat him. So by making him a kind of martyr to the MAGA crowd, that they think maybe that they can beat Trump, but maybe not somebody like a DeSantis.
Yeah. I think that's true, in the sense that I think that the only challenger that Joe Biden can beat in 2024 is Donald Trump, because so many people hate him. But I don't know that Alvin Bragg is playing 3D chess that far ahead. I think it's probably more like a lot of Republicans were about Bill Clinton, about the Clinton impeachment. People like I was, we couldn't stand this guy so much. He kept getting away with so much, Bill Clinton, that somebody had to hold him accountable for breaking the law. And it ended up, he was impeached but not convicted, and it blew back on Republicans because the American people didn't like what Bill Clinton had done, but they felt that it was just too much to do to a president over sex.
It might be the original Republicans pounce story. Now that I think about it, right? I mean, so the backlash, so that that sort of becomes the frame. So the Republicans act on the impeachment and they bring it off, but then they are the ones who sort of pay the price, so to speak.
But I remember, Kale, back then. I remember where I was sitting in my apartment in New York City the day Clinton was impeached, and I thought, finally, justice. And I realized, I was young then. I was in my early 30s. I realized now that what I couldn't see back then. Back then, I was surrounded by fellow conservatives. Couldn't stand Clinton. We had talked ourselves into how he's history's greatest monster, and we could not recognize the broader picture and why this could come back to hurt us. Why it might be reasonable for Americans. Maybe it's somewhat hypocritical, but still reasonable when you consider the stability of the country to oppose Clinton impeachment.
Right.
I'm 56 years old now. I can see the wisdom there. I can see the wisdom of Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon, even though had I been a young person back then, I would have been outraged. But I think the Democrats have gotten high on their own supply here, and they don't see the danger here. Now, mind you, Trump, they say that the charges Trump may face in Georgia could be a lot more serious.
In Florida, maybe. So there's a Florida one too.
Is there? Yeah, I haven't followed that. In which case, those might be worth pursuing. But campaign finance or paying off a porn star, I mean, but what's going to happen is they're going to fire up the MAGA base so much that if the Democrats do win in 2024, it's going to make this country even harder to govern. And I was talking recently in Budapest. We had a guy in here from the U.S., an academic who studies the military, and he said the military is in real trouble with recruitment. I mean, this is not news. It's been reported. Yeah. But he was giving me some of the numbers, at the granular level, and it is a serious crisis. And I said to him, I told him about my story I've told often about how I tried to suggested to my son who was thinking of the military that he not do it. And
even as he's suited for it.
Yeah, he's suited for it, was thinking of doing it. But I said, don't do it because I don't trust the ruling class with your life and also the wokeness in the military and so forth. And the guy I was talking to, my interlocutor, said, this is going to be a real problem. Trying to get the people who are the class, the families that usually, because military service is often a family tradition.
Of course,
they're starting to lose faith.
Right, and we know this, Rod. I mean, if you look at the predominant tribes, if you will, from which the military has relied for bodies, to sort of put it in that kind of frame of reference, it's flyover country. Right, it's flyover country and urban poor. Right, that this is where the military has been the most successful in terms of recruitment. And in our generation, it became déclassé, right, for people in who are aspired to upper middle class and upper class realities to do the perfunctory military thing, right? I mean, I think one of the gifts, so to speak, sorry to be ironic, but one of the gifts of the post-Vietnam era was that people who went to Princeton or Yale or Harvard or Columbia or whatever, fill in the blank, didn't do military service, right? And so then it really became a kind of divide, in terms of enlisted men and then the necessary officers that were brought up through the various military academies. Mm-hmm. Well, what happens if you don't have anybody show up for you need bodies for a military? Like you can't have, a sort of a fully droned military. Like you need boots on the ground and all of that kind of reality. I mean, what kind of crisis do you anticipate this being? How widespread?
Who knows where it stops? Because this guy was telling me, and again, I've read this elsewhere too, but it's something different to sit next to a scholar who studies this stuff, that there's no way to turn it around quickly. And he was telling me that one of the reasons the military has gone woke insofar as it has is it's trying to react to a different society. Well, okay, fine. You may be reacting to a different kind of society, but you have to ask people who have been those who are the most faithful in sending their kids and raising their sons and even their daughters going to the military. If you've alienated them for the sake of trying to reach out to people who are probably never going to come to you anyway,
right?
What have you done? And if we follow the Roman example, the late Roman example, when they don't have enough Romans to fill the military ranks, they start getting non-Romans. And I think that we may end up seeing the U.S. military pushing to open the immigration floodgates even more for the sake of getting soldiers to defend the empire.
Yeah, I think for me the sort of the bigger takeaway is that we one more time we are kind of living in a real transition time here. Like I really and I say that unironically, of course. Like I really believe that we are on shifting sands in terms of political alignments and the way that we sort of live and move and have our being. So I think the and so to sort of take this back just to this last point, I know we got to go here in just a minute, but this Trump business seems to be indicative of our deepening decadence. And to me, the Trump arrest, or not arrest, sorry, the arraignment. The arraignment.
Well, he was arrested. It's an arrest,
Right. So we don't have the mugshot, the sort of the no. But anyway, fair enough. This is a sort of an indicator of a deeper decadence, and it seems like the Uniparty is going to do everything in their power, legally and I think illegally, to keep the wrong people from having a seat at the table or even, a seat at the controlling levers. I think that they're done. 2016 is still the big story. I think we're still living in the wake of that eruption. And the fact that it implicates the previous regime, the previous administration, sorry, it's probably a nicer way to say it, is hugely disconcerting to me. The fact that in the last days of the Obama administration, they put in place things which would allow them basically to continue to rule, and that's not American. I don't know another way to put it.
You've read your Edward Snowden. I mean, he even before that, he told you what they do. I remember talking to a service member who was involved in intelligence. I was out on the West Coast somewhere, and he was planning to leave the military because he couldn't in good conscience do what he was asked to do. And of course, he couldn't talk about any of it. And I said, what would they do if they knew that you were talking to me now? He said, they do know. I'm like, what do you mean? He said, he said, you've got a smartphone. I've got a smartphone. If they want to know where I am right now, they can do it instantly. And he knew what he was talking about because this was his world. So, I think that we're going to see the fangs bared more, just as the machine in Nashville showed itself, because it got a little hyperactive and showed it what it's really all about. I think that we're going to see this happen more and more. And here's the weird thing. I think Trump is a sign of decadence, but I think he's a symptom, not the cause. Mm-hmm. And when we saw what happened in Stanford with Judge Kyle Duncan at Stanford Law School,
right,
when those elites went berserk and wouldn't let him speak, I knew in that moment, watching that happen, watching that video, that as much as I can't stand Donald Trump, I will crawl over glass to vote for that guy, to keep those elites from gaining control of the machinery of this society, because they will crush people like me and you.
I think invariably so. And, so when I heard Trump at one of his more recent rallies say, I will be your vengeance, or I am your vengeance.
I am your retribution.
Like, I am your retribution. It's like, so I can kind of be circumspect about that. Right. Of course, my old-fashioned ears hear that, and I'm hitting a panic button, because I'm like, that's scary, like that's bad, like vengeance, like this doesn't end. Like I've read my Girard, like this is a problem. Okay, so that part of me hears that, and then I read something like the Siegel piece, and I realize, Trump is a kind of avatar for those of us who don't want to be ruled by the PMC class, the managerial class, the elites, whatever. It's like, it's a tough, man. I feel like in a weird bind right now, because I am so disgusted by the elites that it seems like the only, champion, right, in that old-fashioned Greek sense of champion, the only champion that people who are not part of the elite class have is this guy. It's this guy right here. And look, there he is. And he's being, perp walked essentially, right, to being arrested. Like, for what? Like, again, I'm not going to make excuses for the guy making hush payments to a prostitute. I mean, but honestly, for what? Do you want to play this game? Do you want to open this up? Do we really think that Donald Trump is the only president or senator or congressman or whatever who has engaged in this kind of activity? This is weaponizing the rule of law against political enemies, and that just doesn't end well. I mean, I've read enough history.
And did you see what Matt Walsh, the conservative commentator, put out today? Yeah, he said Democrats took their shot, they missed. Now it's time for a Republican prosecutor to do the same thing to one of theirs. And I'm thinking, no, it's not. Don't do that. That's how the country falls apart. But I think it's going to be extremely hard. The more this goes on, it's going to be extremely hard for reasonable voices on the right to say, no, sit back, be still, don't do this, because they're going to say, why? Look, it keeps happening.
So a friend of mine, Griswold Grimm, he's great. He's a friend of Pastor Paul Vanderklees as well. He says here, how much did Orange Man learn from Vince McMahon? Of course, Vince McMahon is the great promoter of professional wrestling, right? And I would say that one of the things that Trump has always been masterful at is the sort of the kayfabe of the show. But I let's be blunt. For all of my jokes about kayfabe and professional wrestling and political narratives and all of that, this is real. I mean, this picture, that's real. And look, he's probably going to get. My guess is he's going to get prosecuted. He's going to get prosecuted, and he's going to get found guilty because it's Manhattan, and then it's going to go into the appeals process, and he'll get. It'll get dismissed, right? But that's what's going to happen. But this is real stuff, independent of his mastery of the show of politics. And what we see in this Siegel piece is that it is real, right? The forces that are now, it's like when the gun is turned against the boat that it sits upon, that's real. And I think that's the situation we find ourselves in.
And just because Donald Trump is a bad man doesn't mean that the people who are out to get him are good. Right. Because they're not. They're going to come after you too. And I think this is one of the reasons I think people like Glenn Greenwald, Barry Weiss, and others on the left are really so helpful right now because you can't accuse them of being right-wing stooges. They actually see, I mean, Glenn Greenwald is accused of this all the time by the left. He hasn't changed his positions on anything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was hated by the right before, now he's hated by the left.
Mm-hmm.
But he sees it. He sees what this is all about. He sees what they're going to do.
So then the question that I have, and maybe this is the question that we'll leave the audience with, because I know you have somewhere special to go. I don't want to get into that, but that's why
I'm all dressed up.
Got the suit on and all that sort of stuff. This is not a new aesthetic for the two of us, but it's haphazard. But when will people realize that what we're fighting against is not politics in that kind of sense that you and I grew up with politics, but this is religion? I really think it's important that people understand that that's ultimately what we're talking about. And this is a sort of a fight of dogmas in a strange sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how you work your way out of that, right? At one point, liberalism was the sort of the technology that we came up with in order to stop killing one another. Yeah. Right. And it seems that liberalism, while clearly effective in some way, shape, or form, has lost its compelling quality, both on the left and the right. And I'm not sure, this is like this sort of uncomfortable space that you and I find ourselves in. I'm not sure what the solution to that is. But I think recognizing what's going on in our country is ultimately a religious one, should give people a sense of what the stakes are.
Yeah, I was talking with somebody last week who was saying that, well, if you don't have a solution, is it really a problem? I think that is a fundamental mistake. We've not dealt with a problem like this before in Western civilization, with the collapse of the metaphysical framework that has, and the religious framework that has been the superstructure on which liberalism is built. This is something new. And the fact that we don't have that there's no solution here doesn't mean that the problems we're seeing, the challenges, aren't real. Patrick Deneen was criticized for his book, Why Liberalism Failed, because he diagnosed very well that liberalism failed because it succeeded so well in liberating the individual from all unchosen commitments. But you can't run a society that way. I remember some people saying, well, he didn't have a solution for it. Well, okay, yeah, he didn't, because liberalism is so deep in our bones that it's very hard to think beyond the horizons of liberalism. But that doesn't mean that there's no problem with liberalism.
Right. So I got a quick question. This is to end the show. All right. So I'm going to put you on the spot. If you don't have an answer, that's okay. I've got one from my side. So are you reading anything interesting right now? I know you're knee deep in the work with your own book, right? And I know you're making some real progress there. Are you reading anything interesting?
Yeah, I'm reading a book called The Book of Fathers. It's written by a Hungarian. It's a novel. It came out a few years ago. I'm reading it obviously in English. It's a book by a Hungarian novelist who goes back and talks about generations of fathers starting like in the 1700s and living in Hungary and the adventures that have happened to them. And it's basically a history of the Hungarian nation as told through a family line. Wow. And it's some magic realism in there, and it's just fascinating but it's teaching me more about this country where I find myself living now. But I've read history books, but this is really a narrative, and I'm enjoying it a lot. And it has made me realize, to come back weirdly to what we were talking about, it's made me realize what a blessing it has been in America to have been freed from some of these ancient rages and ethnic hatreds and tribal hatreds. This is one of the reasons people came to America, to be free of that. And this is why, if the American experiment is winding down, God forbid, but if it's winding down, it will be a world historical tragedy, because it will mean that men ultimately fall back to earth.
So my friend and colleague, we're in my class right now, we're reading Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And my partner is teaching Tocqueville on the French Revolution. And we were talking yesterday, and people, rightly put sort of the American Revolution in sort of one category and the French Revolution into another. And maybe you and I can talk about that at a different time. But the gist of it is that the American Revolution is kind of a conservative one, and the French Revolution is that sort of eruptive, truly revolutionary one, in the sense that we mean by revolution, not as a return, but rather as a kind of break and inauguration. And he said to me yesterday, after we were seeing all the stuff that you and I are talking about unfold, we're like, maybe the American Revolution is just the slow motion explosion of what we see happen quickly and disastrously in the French Revolution, which I thought was an intriguing thesis.
Quite a thought. That's a really interesting thought.
Yeah, it's a really intriguing thesis.
I mean, Ian McGilchrist in his book, The Matter with Things, is talking about time. And he said he lives I think he lives in the Scottish Highlands or near the Highlands. And he says that from a certain time perspective, the mountains that seem solid will look like waves in a lake. Depending on your perspective.
That's right. It's like if the time is scripted like with this or like this or like this, like your perspective can radically alter in terms of that. Because in the historical record, what's 200 years, right? It's nothing. So the other thing that I'm reading in my other class is, of course, the Odyssey. Amazing. Every year I get to do this. It is a true blessing. But really the book that I'm finally reading, Rod, and we're going to leave it here, is one that you recommended to me, probably a year and a half ago, and I'm finally getting to it. But this is Matthew Crawford's The World Beyond Your Head. Truly amazing, truly fantastic book. A wonderful companion piece, I should say, to Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. Because I think he, like Deneen, it's actually predates Deneen. It is a thorough critique of where we find ourselves in late liberalism. It's really
the attention
fantastic.
Economy. Yeah, and that book, The World Beyond Your Head, is fundamental to the book I'm working on now about enchantment. The basic idea is that you cannot experience anything like enchantment or resonance with the world if you are stuck inside your head. And there are things we can do to get outside our head, but it requires being aggressively countercultural. Right. That's something for next time.
Indeed. Look, everybody, Rod, I want to thank you for coming on the show here. I do appreciate it. Look, when we parted ways with TAC, 6-7 weeks ago, that's our old channel. So I have started a new channel here, and I hope to have Rod on here semi regularly. If I stay nice to him, he'll show up from time to time. But I'm going to continue to do some videos here, both in interviews like this, but also some just standalone shows of me sort of ranting about whatever. Hopefully it's not a rant. Hopefully it's a little bit more informative to my audience. But if you could do me the favor, of course, of liking and subscribing, because this is a new channel. So I think I have like 25 subscribers on this one. But if I could grow that would be very helpful as I try to build this thing out. And like I said, I also, my Substack and Rob's Substack, I'll include that in the description in the notes under here when it gets uploaded as a recording. And to find Rod, you know where to find him. To find me, you know where to find me. And we do appreciate it. And Rod, thank you, brother. Be well.
Oh, be well. And you can find me very soon after Orthodox Easter at the European Conservative. I'll be starting a blog there to write about American and European conservatism. But that blog is probably going to start in about 2 weeks. I'll still be doing my Substack, roddreher.substack.com. And of course, you can find me on Twitter at Rod Dreher.
Thank you, brother. Be well. Take care. Bye-bye. All right.